Welcome everyone to tonight's video chat discussing COVID-19 vaccine research opportunities for IBD patients. My name is Emily Cerciello, and I'm the Associate Director, Digital Health and Engagement for the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation. Tonight's chat is going to highlight two COVID-19 vaccine studies that are currently enrolling IBD patients, Prevent COVID and Corral. We are joined by two of the researchers working on these studies, Dr. Millie Long from the University of North Carolina and Dr. Gil Melmed from Cedars-Sinai. In addition to discussing these important studies, we're also going to address some recent concerns that have popped up around COVID vaccines, including the J&J vaccine and vaccine pause and research related to vaccine antibody production in patients on certain biologics. Dr. Long and Dr. Melmed, thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Emily.
So we have a lot to cover in a short amount of time. As a reminder, the information provided during tonight's chat is meant for educational purposes only. It should not replace any advice you receive from your healthcare team. If you have any questions about your specific care, please reach out to your healthcare provider. If you have other questions regarding IBD, we won't be able to get to them during tonight's chat. So please contact the IBD Help Center at info@crohnscolitisfoundation.org or call 888-MY-GUT-PAIN with any questions you may have. Lastly, if you are watching, please comment below and let us know who you are and where you're coming from. With all that out of the way, let's get started. I'll start with Dr. Melmed. The FDA and CDC recently recommended a pause on the J&J COVID vaccine due to an extremely rare risk of blood clots. What do IBD patients need to know about this?
Yeah, well, we've all read the news, I'm sure, and heard about this. And I think the FDA and CDC are being extremely cautious in their review of potential risks associated with this vaccine. I think that the bottom line is I don't think that people with IBD need to think about this any differently than if they didn't have IBD. As a society, we're waiting for this evaluation to be completed and understand where our governing bodies feel that this vaccine should be redeployed back to the public, which I assume it will be. The question will be, will there be certain people that they would be considered at higher risk that they may put some guardrails around? But that's not going to be different whether you have IBD or not, or whether you're on medications for IBD or not. I don't anticipate there being any differences there.
Great, thank you for the clarification. And Dr. Long, a recent study suggested that there's a lack of SARS-CoV-2 antibody production in patients taking infliximab, also known as Remicade. Can you explain what the study findings showed exactly, and what does this mean for patients who take infliximab or other anti-TNF medications?
Absolutely, and I think that this is an important message because I think what Gil and I are trying to address with our collaborative studies is a better answer to this question. But what has been published thus far is there was a study that looked at individuals on infliximab, also known as Remicade, and what happened to their kind of titer associated with exposure after the first vaccine, and whether or not this rose to appropriate levels. But what I want everyone to remember is no matter if you have IBD or not, these vaccines need two vaccines to reach the appropriate immune response. And it's really that second vaccine that puts it over the edge. And this study looked only after the first vaccine. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that there is going to be an impact in terms of actual outcomes of antibody titers or actually protection against COVID, because that really robust response happens after the second vaccine. And so I think we need more data. It was slightly lower in individuals on infliximab after that first vaccine. But again, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have worse outcomes with the vaccine. And so what it tells me is that we need more data. And that is one thing we want to talk about tonight, how it's just going to be so important to follow people forward over the long term and understand what happens and whether they develop COVID, of course, but also how those titers do over time. And I think we have a great opportunity here to inform everyone with autoimmune conditions to help us to understand the best vaccination strategies for people on medications like infliximab and others. There are many other medications, obviously, that we use for inflammatory bowel disease as well. So I would not look at that study as if you are on infliximab that you are definitely going to mount less of a response. I don't think that's the case. We really need to understand that second vaccine response. And I do want to throw it back to Gil to get his impression of this, because I do think it's important and to see if he is thinking similarly.
Yeah, thanks, Millie. I completely agree with you. I think that study was important in the UK, in the United Kingdom, in England, where in Britain, where it was done, because they have a different strategy, a different public health strategy of giving one dose of the vaccine and not giving the second dose in order to get more first doses into people's arms as in their society. Our public health officials have taken a different approach and have prioritized getting both sequences of the mRNA vaccines, both doses. And so the implications that they have there really aren't relevant to us in the United States. We give the second vaccine and we anticipate that people with IBD, regardless of what therapy they're on, will mount appropriate immune responses. And actually just yesterday, I think it was yesterday, early data was published out of New York from what's called the Icarus study, which looked at, I think there were about 50 patients with inflammatory bowel disease compared to some healthy control patients. So it's a very, very small study. And our study and Millie's, Dr. Long's study, we were going to have thousands of patients to answer this question. But at least in this early look of 50 patients, they mounted absolutely normal vaccine responses, regardless of whether they were on infliximab, Remicade, or other biologic agents, and they were identical to individuals who did not have IBD or were not on those medications. And so I think that what came out of that study that people are talking about in the UK and made its way into the New York Times, that I'm sure many watching this Facebook chat may be aware of, really painted that picture that people on these drugs may not respond as well. But I think that with all of those comments that Millie made about understanding what that study was about, is really has very little relevance, I think, to how we are approaching our vaccines here in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Dr. Melmed, just to clarify, we hear the words immune compromised quite a bit. Can you explain what that means? If all patients with IBD are immune compromised, and if you are considered immune compromised, you should get the vaccine?
Yeah, so immune compromised is it's a word that we use, but I think it's a great question. What does it actually mean to be immune compromised? The immune system is very complex. It's not black and white. It's not a switch that turns on or turns off, although sometimes we like to think of it that way because it's simpler to explain complex concepts. When it comes to immune compromising medications, we talk about medications that quiet down or blunt certain responses of the immune system that are needed for normal functions, like fighting off an infection or responding to a vaccine. But it's not a blanket black or white compromising of the immune system for most medications, particularly the biologic medications, which are not black and white. They're very specific and targeted to specific components of the immune system. So I think that oftentimes in the press and even in the medical literature, we use terms like immune compromised, but it doesn't necessarily reflect when somebody with IBD is on a medication that involves modification, if you will, of their immune system. They're really immune modifying drugs, all the biologic agents, not so much immune suppressant drugs. And I think this is also important when, and I referenced that New York Times article from earlier this week, they lumped together real immune compromising conditions like organ transplant patients who are on multiple heavy duty immune suppressing medications to prevent organ rejection. Those are very, very different than the medications that we're talking about with respect to inflammatory bowel disease. They also included in there certain immune modifying medications that specifically target the kinds of immune responses needed for vaccine responses. We call those B-cell modifying therapies, which we do not use in inflammatory bowel disease. And so we cannot extrapolate from the organ transplant data or literature. We cannot extrapolate from all immune, you can't paint all immune compromising or immune modification drugs with the same brush. We really need to understand specifically what we're talking about. And just to bring it home, that's why it's so important that we have our data coming from our IBD registries and studies, which is what we're here to talk about.
Right.
Yeah, thank you for the transition. Let's move on to the main focus of tonight's chat, COVID-19 research opportunities for IBD patients. So Dr. Long, I understand that while the original COVID-19 vaccine trials enrolled thousands of individuals, they didn't include IBD patients. Can you explain why?
Absolutely. So, when it is so important to test something like this COVID vaccine that's going to be deployed in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of people, you need to try to have as much of a similar group of people as possible. So you don't have as many extra things taken into consideration. And so they really, while they included individuals with autoimmune conditions who were not on medications like we're on, they first need to understand how the therapy works in people who are not on those medications. And who, may be somewhat more alike than different, so that they can see if that signal is there for efficacy of the vaccine. And so as you're working through drug development, it's kind of always such a thing that populations such as a condition like inflammatory bowel disease aren't necessarily included in that first wave. But it becomes very, very important, obviously, to study the effects of this in individuals with a chronic condition like inflammatory bowel disease. And so that's where a next phase comes out in drug development, which is understanding how this happens in unique populations. And so this is a population where we really need to understand not only about their response to vaccination and whether it protects individuals from COVID, but also, of course, and many of my patients are telling me that they want to understand, is there a potential for the vaccine to affect my IBD? And we don't think that's the case. We don't think it's a risk of exacerbation of inflammatory bowel disease. Prior studies have looked at vaccinations, and this has not been the case. But by coming together as a community and collecting this data and reporting it back almost real time, we're going to be able to answer those questions early on to help to inform the community as a whole about all of these aspects. Whether there will be exacerbation of symptoms, what are the side effects specific to people with Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, and what happens to my titer, my antibody titer, initially and over time, and how does that equate with protection against COVID? And so as individuals are getting vaccinated by joining an initiative such as the Cohort Study or the Prevent COVID Study, what that allows is for us to combine our data, really understand not only, for example, individuals with Crohn's disease, but perhaps the subpopulation on a specific therapy, the answers to those questions, and share it back with the community. And so that's what we're trying to do. As individuals get vaccinated, obviously we hope that we'll protect them and the ones they love and others, but by participating in a study such as this, it will help hopefully to protect many more patients with inflammatory bowel disease as we gain further knowledge.
Thank you. So you've explained a little bit about why it's super important for people to enroll in these studies. Let's get into the details a little bit. Dr. Melamed, can you talk about the Corral study that you're running? What do you hope to understand through this study, and what does it look like?
Sure. So our Corral study is we have actually two components to it. We have a component here in Los Angeles, where I'm based at Cedars-Sinai, and we have a nationwide component. So anybody who's around the nation can participate remotely. For those that are living in Los Angeles, we have multiple visits to our center for various collections of blood and other samples, so that we can track pretty closely and intensely over time what's happening after somebody gets a vaccine. And we also want to look to predict what do we know, or can we learn based on somebody's genetic profile, based on somebody's microbiome profile, that can help us understand what's going to happen once they receive a vaccine. And then in our nationwide program, we are sending kits to people's homes where they can do a painless home blood draw and send us back the sample. We give you everything you need to send us back an antibody sample, and we're tracking antibodies at a couple of time points over the course of a year after somebody gets a vaccine. And coupled with those sample tests where we give you back the antibody results, and we share those with you, by the way, we're also conducting multiple surveys at different time points so that we can understand tell us about your IBD, so we can categorize the IBD, your medications, understanding some of the history of your IBD, certain aspects of how you've been dealing with COVID. We're also interested in understanding COVID exposures, family exposures to COVID, and then over time are tracking whether you've had COVID in the interim, after vaccination, even with interim survey checks. So what we are looking to recruit are as many patients as we can, but we're aiming for at least 2,000 patients from around the country. because we think we need those kinds of numbers in order to begin to address some of these bigger questions. Whether somebody had COVID or not is a big question. We don't expect a lot of people to actually get COVID. And so we need a lot of people participating in order to understand that. Millie already mentioned some other very important questions, and we are looking at those as well, the side effects in particular. We have a paper that's right now being put together on GI side effects and IBD flare. It's very hard to distinguish those. If you look at the Pfizer and Moderna trials, upwards of 20% of people had GI side effects, diarrhea, abdominal pain, nausea, even vomiting after their vaccines. So how do we distinguish that from an IBD flare? And so there are ways that we're doing that by asking specific questions and looking at some of the blood tests. And so by having enough people enrolled, having enough representation of people with different forms of inflammatory bowel disease and on different medications, we will be able to get really granular in how we understand the answers to some of these questions.
Thank you. Just a couple clarifying questions. Is there any specific inclusion or eligibility criteria we should be aware of? And then also, can you define for those who are unfamiliar what an antibody titer is or what you're measuring through the blood samples?
Sure. And I know Millie's going to be talking about her study, and she and I have spoken, and a lot of our study goals are very similar as far as study design too, but I'm sure Millie will fill us in. But as far as to address the antibody titers, we're actually measuring two different antibodies. We're measuring the anti-spike antibody. The spike protein is what's in the vaccine, and the spike protein is also the outer coating of the virus. So the spike protein will go up if you've gotten vaccinated or if you've had the infection. That's one protein we're measuring. The other antibody or protein that we're measuring is called the anti-nucleocapsid. That's not in the vaccine, but that is in the actual natural coronavirus that somebody would get with an infection. So we will be able to distinguish based on somebody's blood tests if they've got antibodies from the vaccine or they've got antibodies from an infection or both. And you asked about eligibility and inclusion criteria. Really, anybody who is planning on getting a vaccine or has had a vaccine up to 1 year after getting their vaccine can enroll in our study. Right now, the study is open to people who are 18 years old and older. It will be open to younger people at some point in the near future once we have regulatory approval to do so, and once we see that the vaccines become authorized for younger people. Right now, it's just the Pfizer vaccine at 16 and older.
Thank you, Dr. Melmed. Dr. Long, can you talk a little bit about the Prevent COVID study that you're running and what that's all about?
Sure, absolutely. So Prevent COVID is aimed to study, obviously, the response to vaccination, side effects, just those things that Dr. Melmed mentioned, development of COVID over time, and antibody response. And we're measuring those same two antibodies, the nucleocapsid, which tells us if you've been exposed to the virus previously, had COVID infection, and also the spike protein. It's against the receptor binding domain. This is where kind of either the vaccine or the virus attaches, and we can measure that antibody in a quantitative fashion. So we get numbers. We know how high it goes, and there's a whole range. So that's what's going to be able to help us to compare across as we see this whole range. We're actually measuring those values at the same time as Dr. Melmed's studies, and our hope is that we will be able to combine data to help us to answer a lot of these important questions. And so we get that first blood test about 3 months after your first vaccine, and then we check it at a year. All of those data are returned to you as a patient. You also do receive up to about $130 for participation in the study, and you fill out periodic surveys answering questions about your inflammatory bowel disease and about your exposure to COVID. We actually are approved for 16 and up because of that COVID vaccine. And so we will be starting next week recruiting 16 and 17-year-olds. Right now we're 18 and up. And we have a website that I know you all will share that is linked to the IBD Partners website for Prevent COVID, and people can enroll directly online. Similar to Dr. Melmed, just as he is doing more more studies in patients who are in the local Los Angeles area, we're partnering with 10 separate sites where we're also recruiting patients from their clinics, and we're doing some more in-depth blood work and surveys in those individual spaces as well. But anyone in the US can enroll online to prevent COVID. And instead of a blood kit, like Dr. Melmed has said they're doing for their study, which is super convenient, by the way, we are actually partnering with LabCorp, and there are many LabCorp locations across the country. And you can actually, we have a tool where you can search for the closest one to you to see if that's feasible. And LabCorp is doing all of our blood draws for us and measuring these tests. And so we're also really happily soon to be starting to report information back to patients. And I know Dr. Melmed's study is too, the idea that we want to tell you as real time as possible as we're learning. And so we'll have a dashboard to report that information back. And anyone can go to that dashboard. You don't have to be a member of the study. So we hope that everyone will be able to learn from the participants.
Great, thank you. Millie, you mentioned there's compensation for the Prevent COVID study. Gil, is that the same for the Corral study?
No.
Okay. And can patients enroll in both studies?
Yes, so we've talked
yeah,
about
absolutely.
that. Yeah, and you know, Millie and I are friends, and we've spoken about our respective protocols and have aligned our time points so that we will have an opportunity to work together. So somebody can enroll in both studies. Down the road, though, we envision that there may be questions that neither study in and of itself will have enough numbers to answer. And this may be because we don't have enough people on a certain medication, or we may not have enough people who've gotten a certain vaccine. We're enrolling anybody who's gotten any vaccine. And other such questions where we may need to combine our data in order to be able to really understand results. And so we've talked that through, and you know, are really committed to serving the IBD community as best we can, not having anyone feel that these are competing studies, but we're working together, we're working in tandem. You can participate in both. There are some nuances and differences between them. Some of the questions that we're addressing might be a little bit different in the ways that we're addressing them. And certainly if you live in a location where you can access some of the more intense sampling, like one of the centers that the Prevent COVID is studying, that Millie is involved with, or in the Los Angeles cohort, we will be able to get much more rich data and deeper understanding with those more intense sampling protocols.
Great. And then for both Dr. Long and Dr. Melmed, the idea of combining data and sharing data back to participants immediately is really compelling. What will that look like? How can they use that data? And what is the timeline for starting to return some of that data?
So what we've been doing is, we collect the samples and then we send them out to a large lab that does them, Abbott Labs. That's a lab that runs assays for many studies and around the world, really, for COVID. And so as soon as we get those back from Abbott, we communicate with our patients via email. So it's basically they get an email, and the email, you know, there's some explanation about what the results mean and how to interpret them and what the ranges are that we expect for being positive versus negative. And they'll get an email every time we have a sample that's run. So we have certain time points, and you know, the patients can do from there what they want. We're not, it's all research. And so, you know, I'm not the doctor of the people in the trial. They have their own doctors, and we suggest that if they have clinical questions about what their antibody results mean, that they should discuss that with their doctor. Of course, we're happy to discuss what we can with our patients that are part of the trial from a research standpoint, but we do need to emphasize that this is still in the realm of research, and that everybody has their own unique considerations that they may want to bring up with their doctor once they get these results. I think we're all learning. We're all learning what these results even mean. I actually am a participant in a study. We have a healthcare worker arm of the Corral study. So I'm a participant, and I get my own antibody results, and I'm trying to understand what they mean. So I plot them out and I share them, you know, with my kids and my colleagues and my patients. To you know, we're learning, and I think that over time we'll be learning about this together. We don't know yet what actual level of antibody means that you're protected from getting COVID. we don't know yet, if you have a high level of antibody, how long it takes for that antibody to dip so low that you might need a booster dose. We don't even know that antibodies are the answer. Maybe there are other components of the immune system that are more important than antibodies, like, for example, T cells that some of you may have read about. The T cell is also an important part of the immune system that it can attack COVID, and vaccines induce T cell responses too. So those are some of the things we're also going to be learning about understanding what an actual level of antibody means.
Millie, any additional?
No, I completely agree with everything Gil said, and I think that it is just so important. And you will learn. You will get your own results back, and I think understanding what happens over time, and as the community learns together, we're going to be able to incorporate this into something actionable, like Dr. Mehmed mentioned, where perhaps someday we're going to need a booster dose of this vaccine. We don't know, but by accruing this data, that helps us to understand that. You know, and I think that the other vision we have, one of the things that I'm a part of is the IBD Partners Study, which is an online study, and our Prevent COVID is an offshoot of that. And this is a study that individuals with inflammatory bowel disease can enroll, fill out surveys, actually propose research ideas, and we really provide that data back to them. And so in that model, not only are we hoping to provide individual results back, but we hope to make a dashboard where, and hopefully this will be coming soon, because I just looked at our preliminary data, where you can kind of look up, well, in this cohort, how many people were on the drugs I'm on? Okay, and what were their range of antibody titers, and what kind of side effects did they have after the vaccine? Because I think all of that will be very informative for individuals to understand people with like medications and what is happening to them. And so we want to provide that information as well. Again, not to try to serve as each patient's doctor, but just for information that they could then discuss with their doctor in regards to their own symptoms and how they feel they're responding to the vaccine, or whether or not it might help them in decision making. If someone is hesitant to obtain the vaccine, the more data you see on individuals who are on the same medications you're on and how they did post-vaccine might be reassuring to help you to feel more comfortable getting the vaccine.
Great. And follow up for Dr. Long, Dr. Mehmed as well. You just mentioned how, you know, all of this study work is so that we can answer these research questions. What would you say to patients concerned about getting the vaccine because there isn't enough research yet on IBD patients?
Well, I would say that there have been a lot of wonderful patients thus far who have already received the vaccine. There have also been a lot of doctors who have received the vaccine and other healthcare providers who do have inflammatory bowel disease as well. And the idea is that not only has there been a large number of people without IBD that we really think we do understand some of the safety signals associated with this vaccine, but the number is even further growing. And everything I have seen thus far has been very reassuring. And all of our major organizations, including the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation, have recommended obtaining the vaccine. And that means that a lot of medical professionals as well as patients have put a lot of thought into this and provided that recommendation. And so I hope that individuals, as more information comes out, will have less hesitancy. I will say that I looked at numbers this morning, and there are now 2,700 patients in Prevent COVID. And so that's a lot of patients with inflammatory bowel disease who have received all three types of vaccines, and we're following them forward. And so as you see some of this data, along with the wonderful data coming out of the Cohort Study and others, we're getting bigger numbers, and I am feeling very good about it in our populations. And Dr. Melvin, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think it's important to understand if somebody is hesitant to get a vaccine, why are you hesitant? What are you really concerned about? Is it just because people with IBD weren't included in the trials? Well, as Millie said, now we have a lot of people that have gotten it. I will tell you that there is preliminary data now that's surfacing from different parts of the country and the world that are looking at the question in inflammatory bowel disease, including our own studies. And thus far, as Millie said, as Dr. Long said, everything that we're seeing is very reassuring. The side effect profile, the safety profile from the mRNA vaccines, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, looks to be very similar. We're actually comparing all of our results to our healthcare worker study. That's the one that I mentioned that I was in. We have 2,000 healthcare workers that don't have IBD that we're comparing our results to. Everything looks very similar, and we're not finding a higher rate of side effects. We're not finding a greater severity of side effects, and we're not finding a longer duration of side effects. So the frequency, the duration, and the severity of side effects are all comparable, or actually maybe even slightly better if you have IBD and are on biologic medications. And so the data that are coming out continue to be reassuring. And I think that, you know, if you have inflammatory bowel disease, you've probably had a conversation with your doctor about risks and benefits when it comes to choosing to go on a medication or not. And I think it's the same thing when it comes to a lot of decision making in medicine, as it is with vaccination against COVID. And the concept is that we have to weigh not just the risks of the vaccine, but we have to weigh the risks of not getting vaccinated and understand the implications of being vulnerable to COVID. And we, you know, I probably don't need to explain to this audience, you know, what COVID has done, and certainly the consequences of COVID infection. But when we weigh those against one against the other, and also consider the fact that, yes, there can be potential very, very rare risks. We started out by talking about the J&J vaccine pause. That's based on a risk that's 1 in a million. 1 in a million had this terrible side effect, but that's 1 in a million. And understanding, well, what's the risk of getting COVID if you're not vaccinated? What's the risk of actually having a severe complication from COVID if you do get it? Much, much higher. So recognizing and understanding, I think those numbers is also very helpful for people who are still hesitant to get the vaccine.
Thank you. That's really, really helpful. And Dr. Long, how can potential participants find out about the Prevent COVID study?
Absolutely. So you can go to our website, which is worldwideweb.ibdpartners.org/prevent COVID, and there's full information there. There's a section where you can contact us. We're happy to answer any questions you may have about the study itself. It talks about what the criteria are for inclusion. And as I mentioned, we will be starting with the 17 and 18-year-olds next week, and we're positioned to poise to, as soon as this becomes eligible in younger children as well, to be able to recruit younger children, because obviously it's such an important age group to understand. You know, as an aside, I have 2 teenage kids who participated in one of the trials for one of the COVID vaccines. And the fact that sharing information after vaccination is so enriching to the whole community and helps to bring this to other individuals as well, that we really hope to launch a pediatric initiative as well, because it will really help all of our pediatric patients to understand in their specific community these same questions about side effects and you know, vaccine response and everything else. And so please do check us out online and feel free to reach out with any questions therein.
Thank you. And Dr. Melmed, Dr. Long mentioned there's over 2,000 patients enrolled in the Prevent COVID study. How many people are enrolled in Corral, and where can they find out more? Where can potential participants find out more about it?
Yeah, sure. So we have about 1,500 patients right now in our Corral IBD study, and the website is www.corral-study.org/IBD. And you go on the website, similar to Dr. Long's study, there's information about the study. There's a few different pages you could look at, but right on there, right on the landing page, you have an opportunity to click on whether you live in Los Angeles and want to participate in the local study, or whether you live outside of Los Angeles and want to participate in what we call the remote study, and that takes you directly into being able to enroll into the study. So it's pretty simple. It's just a website, and everything is from there on.
Great, thank you both. And we'll be posting the link underneath this chat on Facebook Live as well. So that's all the time we have for tonight. Dr. Long, Dr. Melmed, do you have any final words you want to share? Anything we missed that you think patients should know?
I think that, you know, like with all research, us researchers, investigators, we rely on you to help us figure out the answers to these questions. And we're very grateful to the foundation for helping to support these programs and others. The foundation is an incredible supporter of IBD research, as everyone should know. But really, we're very grateful to the patients, to all of you that participate in the studies that enable us to answer these questions, which are going to be much more broadly relevant and available for the whole world to learn about. So I just want to thank the foundation and thank all of the listeners.
I agree completely, and we can't do this without you, and we appreciate their time and listening and hearing about our studies. I do want to share one aspect, which is that we really believe in the citizen scientist. You all are so important, not only to help us to complete these studies, but also as collaborators. I want to give one brief example, which is that one of the questions I put into our surveys for Prevent COVID is there something we didn't ask about that you really wished we had asked about? And with that, we've gotten so much feedback from participants that have helped us to revamp our surveys and enrich other collaborations. You know, one participant said, you know, I'm pregnant and you didn't ask me about that. Well, now we're partnering with the large piano study to help to understand COVID vaccine response in pregnant patients with inflammatory bowel disease, all because of that patient participant. And so the idea being, tell us what you want us to study and help us to come to answer those questions. And we really appreciate your collaboration in all of this.
Thank you, Dr. Long. That's exactly why we're having this Facebook Live, is we heard a lot of similar questions, and we really hope that tonight answered a lot of those lingering questions about COVID-19 vaccines and the availability of research opportunities for IBD patients. We will continue to update our website to provide you with the most up-to-date information, and you can find all of our COVID-19 resources, including vaccine information and research opportunities, at www.crohnscolitisfoundation.org/coronavirus. I want to give a big thank you to Drs. Long and Melmed for joining us tonight and for all they do to help patients and caregivers. We're really, really lucky to have them on our side at the foundation. If you have any questions that weren't answered, please do not hesitate to contact the IBD Help Center at info@crohnscolitisfoundation.org or call 888-MY-GUT-PAIN. Have a great evening, everyone. Thank you.